12 world-renowned specialists stood around the mahogany bed, staring at monitors that cost more than a house. They had Ivy League degrees, they had state-of-the-art labs, and they were completely, utterly useless. The man in the bed, a ruthless syndicate boss who ruled the city with an iron fist, was fading away. His empire was preparing for war, but it wasn't a doctor who saved his life. It was the girl sweeping the floor, the one who saw what $1 million in medical degrees missed. The Wolf estate did not feel like a home. It felt like a very expensive waiting room for a funeral. The air inside the sprawling, brutalist mansion was thick with the smell of industrial bleach, expensive leather, and the sour, undeniable scent of a body shutting down. Security guards in tailored suits stood at the end of every hallway, their hands resting over the bulges in their jackets. They watched the medical staff with dead, paranoid eyes. Everyone was a suspect. Everyone was waiting for the king to stop breathing. Gideon Wolf was dying. At 34, he was supposed to be in his prime. He had taken over the city's underground less than 5 years ago, viciously carving out a monopoly on the docks, the unions, and the local politicians. He was a man built of sharp angles and cold calculation, known for a terrifying stillness that made older, tougher men sweat. Now that stillness was just paralysis. He lay in a custom-built hospital bed in the center of his master bedroom. His skin, usually a healthy olive, had turned the color of old parchment. Dark, bruised hollows carved out the space beneath his cheekbones. A web of IV lines snaked into his forearms, pumping clear fluids and experimental drugs into his collapsing veins. Around him stood the 12. That was what the household staff called them. The 12 most expensive, highly sought-after medical specialists on the continent. Toxicologists, neurologists, hematologists, and men who had written textbooks on rare autoimmune disorders. They wore pristine white coats over designer suits. They carried tablets and charts, murmuring to one another in the hushed, arrogant tones of people who were used to being the smartest people in the room. Dr. Philip Mercer, the chief diagnostician, adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses. He looked at the glowing numbers on the cardiac monitor and sighed. "His creatinine levels are spiking again," Mercer said, his voice clipped. "Kidneys are under immense stress. Muscle enzymes are through the roof. It's an escalating cascade of organ failure." Arthur Finch, Gideon's second-in-command, stood by the window. Arthur was a broad-shouldered man with a scarred jaw and a temperament like a landmine. He had barely slept in 3 weeks. "I don't pay you to read me the numbers, Mercer," Arthur growled, his voice low and dangerous. "I pay you to fix it. Is it a poison? Did the Russians slip him something at the summit? Polonium? Ricin? Fucking snake venom?" "We have run a full toxicology sweep 6 times, Mr. Finch," Mercer replied, his tone dripping with practiced patience. "There are no heavy metals, no known alkaloids, no synthetic nerve agents. We are looking at an aggressive, rapid-onset neuromuscular breakdown. It could be genetic. It could be a rare pathogen." "It's a hit," Arthur said, turning to glare at the doctors. "Someone got to him, and if he dies, I'm holding every single one of you responsible." The doctors shifted uncomfortably. They knew Arthur wasn't speaking metaphorically. In the corner of the room, entirely ignored by the men arguing over life, death, and vengeance, was Nora Blake. Nora held a damp microfiber cloth. She was scrubbing the dark oak baseboards. She wore a starched grey uniform that chafed at her collarbone and cheap rubber-soled shoes that made no sound against the marble floor. She was a ghost in this house. The staff were strictly instructed never to speak to the Wolf family, never to make eye contact with the syndicate men, and to make themselves invisible when the doctors were working. Nora was very good at being invisible. She had spent 24 years perfecting the art of not being seen. It kept her safe. It kept her employed. And she desperately needed the $2,000 a week Arthur paid the hazard pay domestic staff. She dunked her cloth into a bucket of warm, soapy water. Wring. Wipe. Move 2 inches to the left. She listened to the doctors. She thought they were idiots, not because they lacked knowledge, but because they were looking at Gideon Wolfe like he was a puzzle on a whiteboard. They looked at the blood work, the MRI scans, the lipid panels. They didn't look at the man. Nora looked at him. She noticed things. She noticed that Gideon's left hand twitched whenever the door opened. She noticed that he wasn't entirely unconscious, even when Mercer claimed he was in a stupor. Sometimes, when the room was mostly empty, Gideon's heavy eyelids would crack open, and he would stare at the ceiling with a look of pure, trapped rage. He wasn't fading peacefully. He was burning alive from the inside. Nora moved to the bedside table to dust the lamp. As she wiped the bronze base, Gideon's hand shifted on the mattress. His fingers brushed the edge of her cleaning cart. She froze. Gideon's eyes fluttered open. The whites were deeply jaundiced, a sickly yellow that made the pale blue of his irises look startling, like cracked ice. He looked at her. Really looked at her. There was no haze in his eyes in that brief second, just a sharp, agonizing clarity. His lips parted. A dry, scraping sound came from his throat. He was thirsty. The doctors were at the other end of the room, arguing over a liver biopsy. Nora looked at the plastic cup of water and the foam swab resting on the tray. The nurses usually did this, but the nurse was on her phone in the hallway, moving slowly, so as not to draw the attention of the arguing men. Nora picked up the swab, dipped it in the ice water, and leaned over the bed. She pressed it gently to Gideon's cracked lips. He didn't pull away. He closed his eyes, drawing the meager moisture in. "Don't let them kill me," he breathed, the words so quiet they barely registered over the hum of the oxygen concentrator. Nora felt a cold spike of adrenaline hit her stomach. She pulled her hand back, dropping the swab onto the tray. She grabbed her bucket and backed away, keeping her head down. She didn't say a word. She couldn't afford to care about a mob boss. She had rent to pay. But as she left the room, the image of his eyes followed her down the hall. 3 days passed. The house grew tighter, wound up like a piano wire ready to snap. Outside the gates, the city was destabilizing. Rumors of Gideon Wolfe's impending death had bled into the streets. Rival factions were testing the borders of his territory. A warehouse on the south side had been torched. Arthur Finch was leaving the estate more often, returning with blood on his knuckles and a darker cloud hanging over his head. Inside, the medical circus continued. Dr. Mercer had ordered a lumbar puncture. They had drilled into Gideon's spine, drawing fluid, testing for meningitis, encephalitis, and prions. Nothing. The results came back perfectly clean. Yet Gideon's muscles were degenerating. His heart rate was erratic. He was slipping into a deeper lethargy, barely able to lift his head off the pillow. Nora kept strictly to her routine. 6:12 a.m., clean the first-floor corridors. 8 a.m., dust the master suite. 10 a.m., launder the bedding. She tried to ignore the man in the bed. She tried to tell herself he was a criminal, a monster who had likely ordered the deaths of dozens of men. He wasn't her problem. But Nora had a fatal flaw. She was fundamentally pragmatic, and she hated watching things break when they could be fixed. It was Tuesday morning. Nora was in the kitchen, a massive stainless steel industrial space that looked like a laboratory. The head chef, Paul, was meticulously preparing Gideon's morning tray. Paul was a new addition to the household. He had been hired 6 months ago, brought in from a Michelin-starred restaurant in Chicago. He was a nervous, exacting man who guarded his kitchen with a vicious temper. "Move out of the way, girl!" Paul snapped as Nora reached past him to grab a fresh stack of cleaning rags. "Sorry," Nora muttered, stepping back. She watched as Paul carefully arranged a silver tray, a bowl of plain oatmeal, a small cup of black coffee, and a tall crystal glass filled with a thick, ruby-red liquid. "What's that?" Nora asked, before she could stop herself. Paul glared at her. "It is his morning juice, freshly pressed, pomegranate, beetroot, and a blend of citrus. The doctors approved it. It's for his blood pressure. Now mind your own business and go scrub something." Nora tightened her grip on her rags and left the kitchen. 20 minutes later, she was in the master suite, emptying the medical waste bins. The nurse on duty had just finished administering Gideon's morning medications. Nora watched from the corner of her eye. Atorvastatin for his cholesterol, amlodipine for his blood pressure, a handful of other pills meant to keep his strained heart pumping. Arthur walked into the room, holding the silver tray Paul had prepared. He set it on the overbed table. "Come on, boss," Arthur said softly, his rough voice dropping an octave. "You got to eat something, just a few bites." Gideon looked barely conscious. He groaned as Arthur hit the button to raise the head of the bed. Gideon didn't touch the oatmeal. He never did. But he reached out with a trembling hand and took the crystal glass of red juice. He drank it slowly, grimacing at the tart taste, before sinking back into the pillows. Nora frowned. Later that afternoon, she was cleaning the master bathroom. She wiped down the marble counters, polished the chrome fixtures, and then moved to empty the trash and check the medical waste. She glanced down at the catheter bag hanging from the side of the bed frame. The fluid inside wasn't pale yellow. It was dark, the color of strong black tea. Nora paused. She wasn't a doctor. She hadn't gone to medical school, but she had grown up in a cramped apartment with a grandmother who suffered from a massive list of ailments. Nora had been her sole caretaker from the age of 14 to 18. She had spent countless hours sitting in free clinics, reading pamphlets, and organizing plastic pillboxes. She knew what dark urine meant. It meant the kidneys were failing because they were choked with protein. It meant muscle was breaking down and flooding the bloodstream. Rhabdomyolysis. Dr. Mercer walked into the room, flanked by 2 other doctors. "His CPK levels are doubling every 12 hours, Mercer said, pacing at the foot of the bed. "The muscle tissue is essentially digesting itself. I want him on continuous dialysis starting tonight. If we don't clear his blood, his heart will stop by tomorrow morning." "Are we starting him on steroids?" one of the younger doctors asked. "We tried steroids. They did nothing. Whatever is destroying his muscle fibers is systemic and aggressive." Mercer rubbed his temples. "It makes no sense. His immune system isn't attacking itself. It's like his body is being poisoned, but there is no poison." Nora stood in the doorway of the bathroom, holding her cleaning caddy. She looked at the empty crystal glass sitting on the nightstand. There was a faint red residue at the bottom. She thought about her grandmother. Her grandmother had taken atorvastatin for her heart. Nora remembered the pharmacist leaning over the counter, pointing a stern finger at the 14-year-old girl. "Make sure she takes these every night, Nora. And listen to me, no grapefruit, you understand? Never let her drink grapefruit juice or eat the fruit. It messes with the liver enzymes. It stops the body from breaking down the pill. The medication just builds up and builds up in the blood until it becomes toxic. It destroys the muscles and shuts down the kidneys." Nora felt a chill crawl up the back of her neck. She looked at the chart hanging at the foot of the bed. Medications, atorvastatin 80 micrograms, amlodipine 10 micrograms. Both were massive doses. Both were heavily metabolized by the CYP3A4 enzyme in the liver. Both had severe, lethal interactions with grapefruit. She remembered Paul in the kitchen. Pomegranate, beetroot, and a blend of citrus. It wasn't a rare assassin's poison. It wasn't an exotic nerve gas or a Russian radioactive isotope. It was breakfast. Someone was giving him a lethal overdose of his own medication, disguised as a health drink. And the 12 smartest doctors in the world were completely blind to it, because it wasn't on a toxicology screen for heavy metals or cyanide. It was just juice. Nora stood perfectly still. The blood pounded in her ears. She could just walk away. It wasn't her job. Gideon Wolfe was a violent man. The world might objectively be a better place if he quietly died in this expensive bed. If she spoke up and was wrong, Arthur Finch might throw her out a window. If she spoke up and was right, whoever was trying to kill the boss would know she ruined their plan. Paul the chef. Or maybe someone higher up. Maybe Arthur himself. She looked at Gideon. He was pale, sweating, his chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate hitches. He looked terrifyingly vulnerable, a king drowning in a puddle. She remembered his eyes. Don't let them kill me. Nora put her cleaning caddy down on the floor. Dr. Mercer was typing on his tablet, dismissing the younger doctors to go prep the dialysis machine. He was alone in the room with Gideon and Nora. Nora stepped out of the bathroom. She cleared her throat. Mercer didn't look up. "Dr. Mercer," Nora said. Her voice sounded thin and shaky. Mercer stopped typing. He looked around the room, as if confused by where the sound had come from. Finally, his eyes landed on the maid in the grey uniform. His brow furrowed in deep irritation. "You need to leave," Mercer said sharply. "This is a sterile environment. You shouldn't be in here during medical consultations." Nora took a step forward. Her hands were sweating. She wiped them on her apron. I think I know what's wrong with him." Mercer stared at her for a long, heavy second. Then he let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Excuse me?" "His medication," Nora said, forcing the words out before she lost her nerve. "The statins, the blood pressure pills. He's taking high doses. I am acutely aware of my patient's pharmacological regimen, young woman. Now take your bucket and get out." Mercer pointed to the door. Nora didn't move. She walked over to the bedside table and picked up the empty crystal glass. She held it up. "The chef brings him this juice every morning," Nora said. "He calls it a citrus blend. It smells bitter, like grapefruit." "So?" Mercer snapped, losing his patience entirely. "He likes juice. The diet is approved. Grapefruit blocks the CYP3A4 enzyme," Nora said. The medical term felt heavy and foreign on her tongue, a ghost of a memory from a free clinic 10 years ago. If he's drinking heavily concentrated grapefruit juice every single morning, his body isn't breaking down the atorvastatin. It's accumulating in his blood. It's causing rhabdomyolysis. That's why his urine is dark. That's why his muscles are dying. Mercer froze. The silence in the room was absolute. Only the slow, steady beep of the heart monitor filled the air. Mercer looked at the maid. He looked at her cheap shoes, her messy bun, the damp cloth hanging from her apron pocket. His ego, massive and fragile, immediately violently rejected the situation. "You are a maid," Mercer hissed, closing the distance between them. His face was flushed red. "You wipe floors. I have 3 board certifications. We have run every test known to modern medicine. Statin toxicity of this magnitude would require him to be drinking gallons of the stuff. And even then, we would have seen signs of liver distress first. You are watching too much television. Now get out before I have Mr. Finch throw you onto the street. Test his blood for the medication levels." Nora pushed back, her fear suddenly turning into a cold, hard anger. "You checked him for poison. Did you check if he's overdosing on the pills you gave him?" "Security!" Mercer shouted, his voice echoing out into the hallway. Instantly, the heavy oak doors swung open. 2 guards rushed in, hands on their holsters. Arthur Finch was right behind them, his face dark as thunder. "What the hell is going on here?" Arthur demanded. "Remove this woman immediately," Mercer said, pointing a shaking finger at Nora. "She is interfering with a critical care patient." Arthur looked at Nora. He had barely ever noticed her before. She was just part of the furniture. "What did you do?" Arthur growled, stepping toward her. He towered over her, a wall of muscle and suppressed violence. Nora didn't flinch. She had grown up in a neighborhood where men like Arthur were on every corner. You never showed them your throat. "He's being poisoned," Nora said directly to Arthur, looking him dead in the eye. "Not by a hitman. By the kitchen. The chef is giving him concentrated grapefruit juice. It's interacting with his heart medication. It's destroying his muscles. If they put him on dialysis tonight without stopping the medication and the juice, his heart will give out." Arthur stopped. He looked at Mercer. "What is she talking about?" "She is spouting medical jargon she likely read on Wikipedia." Mercer sneered. "Arthur, the patient's condition is critical. We cannot have hysterical staff members interrupting care." Arthur looked back at Nora. He studied her face. She was terrified, yes, her hands were trembling slightly, but her eyes were locked onto his, desperate and fiercely certain. "If she's full of shit," Arthur said slowly to Mercer, "prove it. Run the blood test. Check the medication levels." "It is a waste of resources," Mercer argued. "Time is of the essence. We need to prep the dialysis." "I said." Arthur stepped closer to the doctor, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Run the fucking test, Philip, or I will cut your throat and run it myself." Mercer swallowed hard. He looked at Arthur, then at Nora, his eyes full of venom. He snatched an empty vial and a syringe from the cart. "Fine," Mercer snapped. "I will draw the blood. I will send it to the lab on a rush, and when it comes back showing normal therapeutic levels, I want her fired and thrown off the property." "If you're wrong," Arthur said to Nora, his tone promising pain, "you'll wish you were just fired." Nora refused to back down. "I'm not wrong." The next 2 hours crawled by. Guarded in the hallway, she sat silently, staring at the marble floor and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe she had challenged experts for nothing. Then the elevator doors opened. A frightened lab technician rushed down the hall with a manila folder and disappeared into the master suite. A minute later, the heavy doors opened. Arthur Finch walked out. He looked pale. The violent energy that usually radiated from him had been replaced by a cold, terrifying stillness. He walked down the hall and stopped in front of Nora. He looked down at her for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick wad of cash, and tossed it onto her lap. The blood toxicity for atorvastatin was 8 times the lethal limit. Arthur said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Mercer is packing his bags. Paul the chef is already in the basement, having a very painful conversation with my men." Nora let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 2 hours. "Come with me," Arthur said. "Am I fired?" Nora asked, standing up, the cash slipping from her lap to the floor. Arthur looked at her, the ghost of a dark smile touching the corner of his scarred mouth. "Fired?" Arthur said, "No, the boss is awake. They flushed his system. He's weak as a kitten, but his vitals are stabilizing. He specifically asked for the girl with the damp rag." Nora followed Arthur back into the master suite. The room felt different. The oppressive, suffocating weight of impending death had lifted. The 12 doctors were gone, leaving only a single, quiet nurse checking an IV line. In the center of the room, Gideon Wolfe was propped up on his pillows. He looked terrible. He was still jaundiced, still hollowed out. But the deadness in his eyes was gone. The sharp, terrifying intelligence had returned, burning brightly behind the pale blue irises. He watched Nora walk to the foot of the bed. "They tell me," Gideon's voice was a harsh, scraping rasp, "that I was nearly assassinated by a citrus fruit." Nora didn't know what to say. She nodded. "Yes, sir." Gideon stared at her. 12 of the most educated men on the planet. Millions of dollars in equipment. And they were going to let me die because they were too busy looking for a dragon to notice a snake in the grass. He tilted his head. "What is your name?" "Nora. Nora Blake." "Why did you speak up, Nora Blake?" Gideon asked. His eyes searched her face, looking for an angle, a motive. "You could have stayed quiet. You could have let me rot. You don't strike me as someone who harbors a great love for men like me." "I don't," Nora said honestly. Arthur shifted uncomfortably behind her, but Gideon held up a weak hand to silence him. "Then why?" Gideon asked. "Because I hate waste." Nora said, her voice steadying. And it seemed like a stupid way for a man to die. Gideon stared at her for a long time. A slow, rusty sound emerged from his chest. It took Nora a second to realize the ruthless syndicate boss was laughing. A stupid way to die, Gideon repeated, closing his eyes as a genuine smile broke through the pain on his face. Yes, I suppose it was. He opened his eyes and looked at Arthur. Arthur, double her pay. No, triple it. She doesn't clean floors anymore. She reports directly to me. Nora blinked. I don't know anything about running a syndicate, Mr. Wolf. I don't need you to run a syndicate, Gideon said softly, the exhaustion pulling him back down into the pillows. I need someone who actually sees what they're looking at. Stay close, Nora. The people who tried to feed me that poison are going to realize I'm not dead soon, and when they do, I'm going to need someone watching my back who isn't blind. He closed his eyes, his breathing evening out into a real, restful sleep. Nora stood at the foot of the bed, the heavy weight of her new reality settling over her. She was no longer invisible. She had stepped out of the shadows and straight into the crosshairs of a mafia war. But as she looked at the sleeping king, she realized she wasn't entirely afraid. The transition from invisible domestic worker to the boss's personal shadow was not smooth. For the first week, the mansion staff kept their distance from Nora. The maids who had once shared meals with her now avoided her, and the guards watched her with wary eyes. No one knew what to make of her. They only knew the boss had been dying, and after the girl in the cheap shoes spoke to him, he was alive again. Arthur Finch bought her clothes. He didn't ask her size or her preference. 3 days after the incident with the juice, a rack of garments appeared in her newly assigned bedroom on the second floor. Black trousers, slate-grey blouses, flat, rubber-soled Oxfords made of fine Italian leather, the uniform of a professional observer. Put these on. Arthur had grunted, dropping a heavy silver wristwatch on her dresser. The boss wants you in the study in 10. The study was a massive room lined with mahogany bookshelves and bulletproof glass. Gideon Wolf sat in a high-backed leather chair by the window. He was still frail. The aggressive dialysis had saved his heart, but the muscle breakdown had left him weak. His tailored suit hung slightly loose on his frame. He looked like a wolf that had survived a harsh winter, thinner, sharper, and utterly devoid of patience. Sit, Gideon commanded, not looking up from the tablet in his lap. Nora sat on the edge of a velvet sofa. She kept her hands folded in her lap. Arthur spent the last 48 hours extracting information from our esteemed chef Paul. Gideon said, his voice quiet, raspy, but carrying a lethal undertone. It was tedious. Paul is a coward, but he was terrified of whoever paid him. He finally broke at 4 this morning. Nora didn't ask what breaking entailed. She had seen Arthur wash his hands in the kitchen sink at dawn. The water had run pink for a long time. He was wired $500,000 through a shell company in the Caymans. Gideon continued, finally looking up. His pale blue eyes locked onto hers. He was given a schedule. Squeeze the juice, serve it, watch me die. He didn't know who the money came from, but he remembered a smell on the man who gave him the burner phone. Nora frowned. A smell. Cigar smoke and peppermint, Arthur said from the doorway. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed. Distinctive. It's a cheap combination, Gideon said smoothly, but a very specific one. Only one man in my organization smokes Romeo y Julietas and chews peppermint gum to hide it from his wife. Donovan. Nora knew the name. Donovan was a capo. He ran the West Side docks. He was loud, wore flashy rings, and always left muddy footprints on the marble foyer when he visited. Donovan isn't smart enough to orchestrate a biochemical assassination, Gideon said, leaning back and closing his eyes. Which means someone is backing him. A rival family, the Italians in the North End, the Russian syndicate. Someone promised Donovan my chair if he cleared the room, so we bring Donovan in. Arthur growled. "We take him apart." "No." Gideon's eyes snapped open. "If we take him apart, whoever is pulling his strings goes to ground. We wait. We let Donovan think the poison is still working. We let him think I'm a vegetable." Gideon looked at Nora. "That is where you come in." "Me?" Nora asked. "You see things, Nora. You see the stains on the baseboards. You see the color of fluid in a bag. I am going to have visitors over the next few weeks, men paying their respects to a dying king. I want you in the room. I want you pouring the coffee, and I want you to look at them the way you looked at me." "I looked at you because you were dying," Nora said softly. "Look at them to see if they are lying," Gideon replied. "People ignore the help. They will talk over you. They will sweat. They will twitch. Watch their hands. Watch their eyes. Tell me what they break." Nora swallowed hard. "And if I get it wrong?" Gideon tilted his head. A dark, genuine amusement flickered across his face. "Then I suppose we will both find out what happens when my luck runs out," he said. 2 weeks passed, the mansion became a theatre, and Gideon Wolfe was the lead actor. To the outside world, Gideon was still confined to his bed, clinging to life by a thread. In reality, he was conducting intense, agonizing physical therapy in the soundproofed basement gym. Nora was the only one allowed in the room besides Arthur. She stood by the wall with a towel and a bottle of water, watching a man rebuild himself through sheer, stubborn malice. Gideon would push himself on the parallel bars until his arms shook violently, his face pale and slick with sweat. He refused pain medication. He said it clouded his judgment. "Again," Gideon gritted out, his knuckles white as he hauled his weight forward on the bars. "Boss, your heart rate is spiking," Arthur warned, looking at a monitor. "I said again," Gideon snarled. His left leg gave out. He collapsed, catching himself heavily on the bars, his breath tearing through his chest in ragged gasps. Arthur stepped forward, but Gideon shot him a look so venomous the larger man froze. Nora didn't hesitate. She walked over, opened the water bottle, and held it out. She didn't look at him with pity. She looked at him with the exact same deadpan expression she used when scrubbing the countertops. "You're going to tear a muscle," Nora said flatly. "And then Dr. Mercer's replacement will put you back in the bed, and Donovan will take your chair." Gideon glared at her, chest heaving. He snatched the water bottle from her hand. He drank half of it, poured the rest over his head, and wiped his face with a trembling hand. "You have a very irritating way of being right, Nora," he muttered, but he stepped away from the bars. The intimacy of these moments was strange. Gideon was a man who projected invulnerability. Yet he allowed this former maid to see him crawl, sweat, and fail. He trusted her because she had nothing to gain from his weakness. She wasn't angling for a promotion in the syndicate. She just wanted the machinery to work. That afternoon, the theatre opened its doors. Donovan arrived to pay his respects. The master bedroom was darkened, the curtains drawn. Gideon lay in the bed, an IV line taped to his hand. Running saline, though the bag was labelled with complex medical jargon. The heart monitor beeped with a slow, lethargic rhythm, artificially manipulated by a technician on Arthur's payroll. Nora stood in the corner, holding a silver tray with a pitcher of ice water. The heavy oak doors opened. Donovan walked in. He was a thick, barrel-chested man wearing a suit that was a little too shiny. The smell hit the room instantly. Heavy cigar smoke and a sharp, minty sweetness. "Christ, boss," Donovan said loudly, stopping at the foot of the bed. He took off his fedora, clutching it in front of his chest. "You look like hell." Gideon's eyes fluttered open. He turned his head slowly, playing the part of a man struggling through a thick fog. "Donovan," Gideon whispered, his voice incredibly weak. "We're holding the line, boss. The docks are secure," Donovan said, taking a step closer. "But the men are getting nervous. Word on the street is Well, word is you're not bouncing back from this one. Nora watched Donovan's hands. His right thumb was furiously rubbing the brim of his hat, back and forth. A self-soothing gesture. Let them talk. Gideon rasped, closing his eyes. I just need rest. Course you do, Donovan said. He looked around the room. His eyes swept over Nora, dismissing her instantly as part of the decor. But as his gaze moved past her, Nora saw something else. Donovan was sweating. Not just a little. A cold, thick sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the room being heavily air-conditioned. And his eyes kept darting to the IV bag. Why is he looking at the bag? Nora thought. He thinks it's the medication. He thinks the poison is still flowing. Arthur says the doctors are stumped. Donovan pressed, his voice dropping into a tone of false sympathy. Say it's your kidneys? Failing. Gideon lied beautifully. Donovan nodded slowly. Well, you just rest, boss. I'll handle the street. I won't let the family fall apart. He turned to leave. As he walked out, he pulled a pack of peppermint gum from his pocket, his hands shaking just slightly. The door clicked shut. Gideon sat up in bed, ripping the IV tape off his hand. The illusion of weakness vanished instantly. His eyes were cold, calculating. Well? Gideon asked, looking at Nora. Nora set the tray down on the dresser. He's terrified. Nora said. He couldn't stop looking at the IV bag. He wanted to make sure you were still dying. But it wasn't just anticipation. It was fear. Fear of me? Arthur asked, stepping out from the adjoining bathroom. No, Nora said, shaking her head. A man who thinks he's about to inherit an empire doesn't sweat like that. He was scared of failing. Whoever hired him to poison Mr. Wolf, Donovan is terrified of them. He came here to confirm the job was done because his boss is demanding proof. Gideon smiled. It was a terrifying expression. Exactly, Gideon said softly. Donovan is a middleman, and middlemen always crack when the pressure changes. Arthur tapped Donovan's phones, put eyes on his wife, his mistress, and his favorite bartender. He's going to make a meeting tonight to report my imminent death. I want to know who is sitting across the table from him. The intelligence came back fast. At 2:00 a.m., Arthur slammed a file onto the kitchen island where Gideon was sitting, drinking black coffee. Nora was wiping down the espresso machine nearby, a habit she couldn't quite break when she was thinking. Not going to like it, Arthur said, his jaw tight. Gideon opened the file. There were grainy, long-lens photographs of a diner on the outskirts of the city. Donovan was sitting in a booth. Across from him was a man with slicked-back grey hair and a sharp, tailored overcoat. Carmichael, Gideon said. His voice was deathly quiet. Nora paused her wiping. She had heard the guards whisper that name. Silas Carmichael was the head of the Irish syndicate across the river. He was old money, brutal, and, historically, an ally of the Wolf family. A treaty had held their borders for a decade. Carmichael is breaking the treaty. Arthur said. He bought Donovan. He tried to poison you so it would look natural. No bullets, no bombs, no mob war. You die of organ failure. Donovan takes the seat and hands the West Side docks over to the Irish in exchange for protection. It's elegant, Gideon admitted, staring at the photo. And cowardly. What do we do? Arthur asked. We can hit Carmichael's compound tonight. Burn it to the ground. No, we don't start a war in the dark. We do it in the light. Gideon said, standing up. He leaned heavily on the marble counter, his legs still unsteady, but his eyes burning with absolute focus. Tomorrow is the quarterly syndicate sit-down. All the capos, all the allies. Carmichael will be there to offer his condolences and position himself to support Donovan. Gideon looked at Nora. Are you ready to pour some drinks, Nora? I don't think they're going to want what I'm pouring, she replied dryly. The sit-down was held in the estate's grand dining room. It was a massive, cavernous space with a long oak table that could seat 30 men. At noon, the black town cars began rolling through the front gates. Nora stood by the mahogany sideboard, wearing her stark grey blouse and black trousers, a white towel draped meticulously over her forearm. She held a crystal pitcher of water. 10 men filed into the room. They were loud, arrogant, and dangerous. They wore the smell of leather, gun oil, and expensive cologne. Donovan was among them, sweating profusely, chewing his peppermint gum. Then came Silas Carmichael. He walked with a cane he didn't need, projecting an aura of untouchable wealth. They took their seats. The chair at the head of the table remained empty. "Arthur," Carmichael said smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "A tragedy about Gideon. A damn shame. The man was a titan. But we must discuss the future. The city cannot look weak." "The city isn't weak, Silas," Arthur said, standing by the door. "With Gideon on his deathbed." Donovan started, his voice a little too loud. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open. The room went dead silent. Gideon Wolfe walked in. He didn't use a wheelchair. He didn't use a cane. He walked slowly, every step deliberate, his spine violently straight. He wore a midnight blue suit that fit perfectly. The pale, jaundiced look was gone, replaced by a cold, predatory flush. He looked at the men at the table. 10 hardened criminals stared back at him as if a corpse had just crawled out of the earth. Donovan choked on his gum. Gideon walked to the head of the table and sat down. He didn't say a word. He simply folded his hands on the polished wood and waited. The silence stretched, suffocating and heavy. "Gideon," Carmichael finally managed, his smooth facade cracking for a fraction of a second. "Praise God. We were told you were in your final hours." "Reports of my death," Gideon said softly, his voice echoing in the vast room, "were highly optimistic." Nora moved gracefully around the table. She poured water into the crystal glasses. She didn't look at the men's faces. She looked at their hands. Donovan's hands were shaking so badly he had to hide them under the table. Carmichael's hands were perfectly still. Too still. The knuckles gripping his cane were bone white. Nora reached Carmichael's right side. As she leaned in to pour the water, she noticed a subtle bulge under the left breast of his tailored overcoat. That wasn't unusual in this room. Everyone was armed. But it wasn't the gun she noticed. It was the cuff of Carmichael's shirt. As he adjusted his grip on the cane, the sleeve of his coat rode up an inch. There was a faint reddish-purple stain on the white French cuff. It looked exactly like pomegranate juice. Nora's mind raced. Paul the chef said a man gave him the burner phone. Donovan was the middleman. But Donovan wouldn't know how to perfectly calibrate a statin overdose. Carmichael is an educated man. Carmichael ordered it. But did Carmichael hand over the poison himself? Nora finished pouring Carmichael's water. She stepped back, moving towards the sideboard. Gideon was watching her. He didn't look at the capos. He was watching his shadow. Nora caught his eye. She gave a microscopic tilt of her head toward Carmichael, then tapped her own left wrist lightly with 2 fingers. Gideon's eyes narrowed slightly. He understood. "Donovan," Gideon said, turning his gaze to the sweating capo. "You look unwell. Is the air conditioning not working for you?" I'm good, boss. Just surprised. Happy, you know?" Donovan stammered. "I'm sure." Gideon said, "I had a lot of time to think while I was lying in that bed, Donovan, thinking about loyalty, thinking about who profits from an empty chair." Donovan swallowed hard. He looked desperately at Carmichael. Carmichael cleared his throat. "Gideon, this is hardly the time for paranoia. You've had a severe health scare. You should be resting, not interrogating your loyal men." Loyal. Gideon tasted the word. He stood up slowly. "Arthur," the heavy click of a gun safety being disengaged echoed loudly in the room. Arthur had drawn his weapon, aiming it squarely at the back of Donovan's head. Half the men at the table reached for their coats. The guards lining the walls instantly leveled submachine guns at the table. "Nobody moves," Gideon ordered. The room froze. Gideon walked slowly around the table until he stood directly behind Carmichael. "You see, Silas," Gideon whispered, leaning down. "I didn't have a health scare. I was poisoned. Someone fed me a highly concentrated enzyme inhibitor designed to weaponize my own heart medication against me. It was a very smart, very quiet way to kill me." Carmichael stared straight ahead. "A tragedy. You must find the culprit." "I did," Gideon said. He reached down, grabbed Carmichael's left wrist, and violently yanked the man's arm up, exposing the white French cuff. "Pomegranate!" Gideon noted, looking at the faint purple stain. "Used to mask the bitter taste of the grapefruit in the juice. Did you mix the first batch yourself, Silas? To show Donovan how it was done?" Carmichael's face turned a mottled red. "You are insane. I am a guest in this house. You are a dead man." Gideon corrected. Carmichael lunged. Despite his age, he was fast. His hand darted under his coat for his weapon. Before Arthur could pivot his aim, before the guards could fire and risk hitting Gideon, a heavy crystal water pitcher slammed down with bone-crushing force on Carmichael's forearm. The crack of bone was loud as a gunshot. Carmichael screamed, dropping the half-drawn pistol onto the oak table. Nora stood over him. The shattered remains of the crystal pitcher were still clutched in her hand, water and blood pooling on the polished wood. She was breathing hard, her eyes wide but terrifyingly steady. Gideon looked at the gun on the table, then looked at Nora. The silence in the dining room was absolute, broken only by Carmichael's agonizing groans. Gideon reached out and gently took the broken crystal from Nora's hand. He tossed it onto the table. "Arthur," Gideon said, his eyes never leaving Nora's face. "Take Mr. Carmichael and Mr. Donovan to the soundproof room in the basement. I have some physical therapy to do." "Yes, boss." Arthur smiled. As the guards dragged the screaming men away, the remaining capos sat frozen, staring at the boss who refused to die, and the girl in the grey shirt who had just shattered the arm of the most feared Irish mobster in the city. Gideon finally turned back to the table. "The sit-down is concluded," Gideon said coldly. "If anyone else has an issue with my health, speak now." Nobody moved. "Good. Get out." When the room finally emptied, leaving only Gideon and Nora amidst the spilled water and broken glass, the adrenaline began to fade. Nora's hand started to shake. She leaned against the sideboard, closing her eyes. Gideon walked over to her. He didn't crowd her space, but he stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You broke his arm," Gideon said, his voice a low rumble. "He was going to shoot you," Nora said, opening her eyes. I didn't have time to ask politely. Gideon reached out. Slowly, deliberately, he took her trembling hand in his. His thumb brushed over a small scrape on her knuckle caused by the broken crystal. "You saved my life in that bed, Nora," Gideon said quietly. "And you just saved it again. But you need to understand something. There is no going back to the kitchens after this. They all saw you. You belong to this world now. You belong to me." Nora looked up into his pale, piercing eyes. She saw the ruthlessness there, the possessiveness of a king claiming his most valuable asset. But she also saw something else, a profound, unwavering anchor. "I don't belong to anyone, Mr. Wolf," Nora said, her chin lifting slightly. Gideon's lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile. "We'll see about that," he whispered. "Now come. I need my shadow." The transition was absolute. Nora Blake did not go back to the basement. Her belongings were moved from the cramped staff quarters to a sprawling suite on the 3rd floor, directly across the hall from Gideon's. The room smelled of fresh linen and expensive cedar, utterly devoid of the bleach and stale coffee scent that had defined her entire adult life. She stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror, staring at the woman looking back. She was wearing a tailored charcoal suit Arthur had procured. The fabric was heavy, protective, and cut perfectly to her frame. She looked like a professional. She looked like a weapon. "You're staring at yourself like you expect the glass to break." Gideon's voice came from the open doorway. Nora didn't flinch. She was getting used to his silent movements. For a man who had nearly died a week ago, he moved with the terrifying grace of a predator that had finally shed its cage. "I'm trying to figure out what my job actually is," Nora said, turning to face him. "I don't clean. I don't carry a gun. I sit in rooms and watch men lie to you. That is exactly your job," Gideon said. He walked into the room, leaning casually against her heavy mahogany dresser. He was dressed in a black button-down, the sleeves rolled up to expose the fading bruises from his IV lines. The men in my organization have spent years learning how to hide their tells from me. They don't know how to hide them from you. You are the only person in this house who sees the dirt in the corners. And when they realize what I'm doing, they already have. Gideon replied, a dark amusement playing at the corners of his mouth. "Carmichael is currently learning to write with his left hand in a very dark, very unpleasant hole. The rest of the capos know that the girl with the water pitcher is not to be crossed." He pushed off the dresser and closed the distance between them. He stopped just inches away. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. "I need you to look at the ledgers," Gideon said quietly, his eyes dropping to her mouth for a fraction of a second before meeting her gaze again. "Arthur is loyal, but he is a blunt instrument. He sees numbers. I need you to see the patterns. Look at the shipping manifests from the East River docks. I think someone is skimming the pharmaceutical imports." Nora held his gaze. "You're trusting me with the syndicate's books?" "I trusted you with my life, Nora. The books are just math." For the next week, Nora lived in the study. She surrounded herself with leather-bound ledgers, encrypted tablets, and stacks of shipping manifests. She drank black coffee until her hands shook, tracing lines of cargo, union payouts, and offshore wire transfers. She didn't just find a skim, she found a hemorrhage. It was a Tuesday night. The house was dead quiet. Rain lashed against the bulletproof windows of the study. Gideon walked in, dropping a wet trench coat onto a chair. He smelled of rain, cold air, and the metallic tang of gunpowder. Arthur had just cleared out a rogue warehouse on the south side. Nora looked up from the desk. She slid a red folder across the polished wood. "It's not the East River docks," Nora said, her voice raspy from disuse. "It's the trucking routes. They aren't skimming the pharmaceuticals. They're double-logging the transport fees and routing the excess into a shell company in Delaware. It's been happening for 2 years, before you even got sick." Gideon picked up the folder. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the highlighted discrepancies. His face was a mask of cold stone. "Who?" he asked. "It's buried deep, but the authorization codes match the payroll routing for the North End." Nora hesitated. "Carmichael's territory. But he's in your basement, which means someone else picked up the operation the second he went missing." Gideon closed the folder. The crack of the heavy paper sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Carmichael has a nephew," Gideon said softly. "Liam. Young, ambitious, stupid. If he knows his uncle is gone and he knows you caught the skim—" Nora started. "He'll panic," Gideon finished. He looked at Nora, his expression suddenly tightening. The cold calculation vanished, replaced by a sudden, violent realization. "Middlemen panic when the pressure changes, but heirs retaliate to prove they can hold the throne." A dull, heavy thud echoed from the first floor. It wasn't a door closing. It was the sound of a body hitting marble. Gideon's hand instantly went to the small of his back, drawing a suppressed pistol. The safety clicked off. "Arthur is at the warehouse," Gideon whispered, moving to the door. "We only have the skeleton crew on the gates tonight." The lights in the study abruptly cut out. Total darkness swallowed the room. The only illumination came from the lightning flashing outside the massive windows. "Get under the desk," Gideon ordered, his voice a low, lethal hum. Nora didn't argue. She dropped to the floor, sliding beneath the heavy mahogany structure. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. She had spent her life avoiding violence, keeping her head down, staying invisible. Now the violence had come directly to her front door. The silence was agonizing. Nora crouched in the dark, her hands pressed flat against the thick rug. Outside the study, the sound of muffled footsteps echoed on the hardwood hallway. Heavy boots, wet rubber. Gideon stood perfectly still beside the doorframe. He wasn't a man who waited to be hunted. He was the apex predator in his own house. The handle of the study door turned slowly. As the door pushed open, lightning illuminated the silhouette of a man holding a tactical shotgun. Gideon moved faster than Nora could process. He stepped into the doorway, grabbing the barrel of the shotgun and violently wrenching it upward. The gun went off, blowing a massive hole into the ceiling plaster. In the same fluid motion, Gideon drove the butt of his pistol into the man's throat. The intruder collapsed, gagging on his own crushed windpipe. "Stay there!" Gideon hissed into the dark, before stepping over the body and disappearing into the hallway. Nora heard the suppressed thwip-thwip of Gideon's weapon. A heavy crash, a man screaming. Then a sickening crunch of bone. She squeezed her eyes shut. She was terrified, but her pragmatic brain was rapidly cataloguing the situation. The backup generator hadn't kicked in. That meant they had disabled the main line and the failsafe. This wasn't a street gang. This was a professional hit squad, and Gideon was still weak. The dialysis had saved his life, but his endurance was fractured. He couldn't fight a dozen men in the dark. A shadow shifted near the study windows. Nora opened her eyes. The glass hadn't broken. It was bulletproof, but the heavy oak side door that led to the terrace had been jimmied open. A man stepped into the study. He didn't have a gun. He held a serrated hunting knife, the blade catching the faint moonlight. He hadn't come through the hallway. He had scaled the trellis. He didn't look towards the doorway where the first body lay. He looked straight at the desk. He knew who he was looking for. Liam hadn't just sent men to kill Gideon. He had sent men to kill the girl who broke his uncle's arm. Nora held her breath. She looked around the cramped space beneath the desk. There were no weapons. Just a wastebasket, a surge protector, and a heavy brass letter opener sitting on the edge of the desk above her. The man took a step closer. His boots squelched on the rug. Nora didn't wait to be dragged out. She didn't cower. She reached up, grabbed the heavy brass letter opener, and lunged out from under the desk. She didn't aim for his chest or his head. She aimed for his knee. She drove the brass spike directly into the side of the man's joint with every ounce of strength she possessed. The man let out an agonizing roar, his leg buckling instantly. He crashed to the floor, dropping the knife as his hands flew to his shattered knee. Nora scrambled back, her hands slick with sweat. She scrambled towards the door, trying to get to the hallway. The man snarled, grabbing her ankle. His grip was like a steel vice. He yanked her backward, pulling her flat onto her stomach. She kicked wildly, her heavy Oxford shoe connecting with his ribs, but he didn't let go. He reached out with his other hand, desperate to reclaim his dropped knife. "Let go of her." The voice wasn't a shout. It was a demonic, hollow whisper that sucked the air out of the room. The lights flickered and suddenly roared back to life as the backup generator finally engaged. Gideon stood in the doorway. He was drenched in blood. Most of it wasn't his. His chest heaved, his face pale, but his eyes were black with a rage so pure it was terrifying to witness. The intruder froze, looking up at the syndicate boss. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to negotiate. He never got the chance. Gideon raised his weapon and fired 3 times. Center mass. The grip on Nora's ankle went slack. The room plunged into an eerie silence, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of the 2 survivors. Gideon dropped the empty magazine from his gun, slammed a fresh one in, and holstered it. He walked over to the dead man, kicked the body away from Nora, and knelt beside her on the floor. His hands, usually so steady, so violently precise, were shaking. He grabbed her shoulders, pulling her up into a sitting position. His eyes scanned her face, her neck, her arms, looking for a wound. "Are you hit? Did he cut you?" Gideon demanded, his voice cracking. "No!" Nora gasped, her lungs burning. "No, I'm okay, I'm fine." Gideon didn't seem to believe her. He pulled her against his chest, crushing her to him. The smell of blood and rain was overwhelming, but Nora didn't pull away. She buried her face in his shoulder, her hands gripping the fabric of his ruined shirt. She could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. It was beating frantically, wildly out of control. "I told Arthur." Gideon whispered into her hair, his voice raw. "I told him you were the most dangerous thing in this house. Liam didn't send a hit squad for me, Nora. He sent them for you. They know you're my eyes." He pulled back just enough to look at her face. The cold, untouchable Mafia Boss was completely undone. "They know you are the only thing in this world I cannot afford to lose," Gideon said. Nora looked into his pale blue eyes. The invisible line between the boss and the maid, between the king and the shadow, evaporated into the cordite heavy air. "Then we better make sure Liam doesn't have a world left by morning," Nora said, her voice steadying into cold steel. Gideon stared at her. The terror in his eyes slowly morphed into a dark, feral reverence. He reached up, cupping her jaw with a blood-stained hand. "God," he breathed, leaning in. "You are magnificent." The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision. It tasted of adrenaline, copper, and desperation. Gideon kissed her like a man dying of thirst, his mouth bruising and demanding. Nora kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer. There was nothing soft about their world, and there was nothing soft about this. It was a claim. It was an anchor in a sea of blood. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily. Gideon rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Arthur is clearing the grounds," Gideon said quietly. "Liam's men are dead, but Liam is still breathing." "Where is he?" Nora asked. "He operates out of a high-rise in the financial district. Thinks he's untouchable behind corporate security." Gideon opened his eyes, pulling back to look at her. "I'm going to burn it to the ground." "No," Nora said, standing up. She smoothed down her charcoal jacket, forcing her shaking hands to still. "If you burn the building, you start a war with the police, the feds, and the Irish. You don't bomb him. You strip him." Gideon stood up, watching her carefully. "Explain. The ledgers." Nora pointed to the desk. "Liam has been routing the skimmed money through a Delaware shell company. But to do that, he needs digital authorization keys from the main Irish syndicate accounts. Keys he only has because his uncle is missing." Nora walked over to the desk, stepping neatly around the body on the floor. She picked up the encrypted tablet. "I didn't just find the discrepancy, Gideon. I traced the routing numbers. I have the account information. We don't send a hit squad, we drain the accounts. Every single offshore dime the Irish syndicate possesses. We take it all." Gideon walked slowly towards the desk. He looked at the tablet, then looked at Nora. "If we drain their accounts," Gideon said softly, "Liam won't be able to pay his men. He won't be able to pay the politicians or the police. He'll be a king with no gold. His own lieutenants will tear him apart before noon tomorrow." "It's cleaner," Nora said, "and it sends a better message. Bullets mean you're angry. Taking their entire empire with a keystroke means you are untouchable." Gideon threw his head back and laughed. It was a dark, rich sound that echoed in the ruined study. "They tried to poison me with a breakfast drink," Gideon said, shaking his head. "And you are going to bankrupt an 80-year-old mafia dynasty with an iPad." He walked behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, looking at the glowing screen of the tablet. "Do it," Gideon ordered quietly. Nora typed in the command sequence she had meticulously built over the last 4 hours. She bypassed the firewalls using the authorization codes Liam had carelessly left exposed in the shipping manifests. She hit execute. On the screen, a progress bar flashed. The offshore accounts of the Irish syndicate, holding millions of dollars in illicit funds, began transferring rapidly into heavily encrypted, untraceable ghost accounts controlled by Arthur Finch. 10%, 50%, 100%, balance 0.00. Nora set the tablet down. "It's done." Gideon turned her around in his arms. The violence in the room was still present, the bodies still bleeding on the floorboards, but the air felt entirely different. The war was over before the sun even came up. "You came into this house holding a mop," Gideon said, his thumb gently wiping a smear of dust from her cheek. "And you just conquered the North End." "I hate waste," Nora replied, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips. "Leaving all that money in the hands of an idiot seemed wasteful." Gideon kissed her again, slower this time, a deep, possessive promise. "You don't stand in the corner anymore, Nora," Gideon murmured against her lips. "You sit at the table, right beside me. You own this city just as much as I do." Nora looked at the man who ruled the underworld, the man she had pulled back from the brink of death. She wasn't a maid anymore. She wasn't just a shadow. She was the architect of his survival and the weapon of his reign. "I know," Nora said. They walked out of the study together, leaving the darkness behind, stepping into a house that now belonged entirely to them. From invisible maid to the most dangerous woman in the syndicate, Nora proved that power isn't about who holds the biggest gun. It's about who sees the board clearest. Gideon and Nora's empire was built on a single, undeniable truth. Never underestimate the person sweeping the floors.